So we might start off. Hopefully everybody has managed to join. Um, so a very warm welcome to everybody to the first lecture of Ethics and Privacy Week. Um, so this is the first online lecture, but we will have some hybrid sessions as well over the course of the week, and maybe we can add the schedule for that as well. So today we're going to be focusing a little bit on AI specifically. So one thing's for sure is that AI is absolutely dominating the news in recent years. So we're absolutely so lucky to be joined by Louise McCormack, who is a PhD researcher at the Adapt Centre in the University of Galway. And Louise's PhD is specifically in the field of computer science, and there's a focus on developing a tool to score AI for trustworthiness, right? So this is around the idea of trustworthy and ethical AI. So Louise has actually won at the University of Galway's thesis challenge for best research communication. So we're so lucky to have her here today, and she's also given talks for the likes of TEDx. So really delighted to have her here today. Her research is shaping the future of AI and AI that is both powerful and ethical. So if you do have any questions at the end, please let us know. As I said, the webinar will be recorded, and so you'll be able to see it later on. And if you do have any questions, please let us know. And I'll leave it over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much for that intro. I will try and live up to that and give a good talk that's worth your lunchtime logging in today. So trustworthy AI is a term that everybody is going to start hearing about more and more. If you're in research, you might already have heard about it. And if you're working in business, you might have heard the term used responsible AI or ethical AI. And those three words are typically being used interchangeably, referring typically to the same thing. So trustworthy AI is a term that was coined by the European Union. So back in 2018, the EU set up a commission essentially to figure out what ethical AI would look like. And AI means everything and kind of nothing. It kind of just means a smart computer. It can mean machine learning. It can mean a large language model. It's kind of a really all-encompassing word. So to develop guidelines for how to make something ethical when that something means kind of everything was a real challenge. They came back in 2019 and published a framework of 7 principles that AI should adhere to in order to be considered trustworthy or kind of ethical, safe in society. The next year, they published an assessment list to say, okay, you've got the 7 principles. Here are some questions that you could ask, a developer could ask about a system in order to see if it's adhering to these principles. And the principles themselves are referred to within the AI Act as non-legally binding principles. And the AI Act is being rolled out currently. It's coming in stages. The bulk of it comes into force on the 2nd of August next year. There is an act coming in, Article 5 comes in on the 2nd of February this year. And that kind of is for the most highly restricted, prohibited things. It's prohibited practices. Prohibited practices under the Act have the highest level of fines, up to 7% of global revenue. So it's quite a strict penalty, and that comes into force in less than a week. Last December, the International Standard Organization published ISO 42001. This is going to be huge in industry. After Pure, we saw the introduction of ISO 27001, which had a huge uptake in industry, and most tech companies would aspire to have it or have already gotten it. And with the AI Act, the corresponding ISO is 42001. And so if the ISOs like 27001 and there's the corresponding NIST ones as well, they kind of have brought in the concept of privacy by design. So we all now think of data in a way that we didn't think about data 8 years ago. So when the GDPR came in, I was working in a regulated sector. At the time, I was working in an insurance company. And anyone who was working at that time will have seen firsthand all of the changes that we've made to how we collect data, how we design systems to minimize the collection, how we ensure consent is collected, how we store data, how we process data, and the policies that we have around deletion for it. This has been significant change, and I'm drawing parallels to GDPR because we're about to see a huge change happen over the next 6 to 8 years with the introduction of the AI Act. And if GDPR brought in privacy by design, what we're about to see is the introduction of ethics by design, which does include privacy by design, as well as a number of other principles. So the 7 principles that were identified by the EU and which are referred to, as I say, in the AI Act as non-legally binding principles are these. Some of these principles are actually legally binding. They're actually pretty harsh enforced within the Act. So there are a lot of tangible deliverables that people have to include around these principles. And some of them have less tangible enforcement in the Act. So the first principle is human agency and oversight. So again, we're talking about agency and oversight of an AI system. And going back, an AI system can really be just about anything. So what sufficient human agency and oversight looks like from one sector or one use case to another will be completely different. But essentially, you could think of it like identifying the risks of that system and ensuring that there are sufficient monitoring processes in place and sufficient human ability to see that monitoring process, and where required to actually have agency and take control and make changes to that system. The second one and the third one are 2 areas that are actually quite well established in industry at the moment. So technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance. These have been a top priority for most companies because of the focus on safety and data governance over the last 6 to 8 years. We, of course, have new threats. The barrier to entry for how easy it is to hack a system. You don't need to develop skills to learn an obscure language and launch a fairly sophisticated attack anymore. That barrier has been reduced, and so we have seen an increase in the number of attacks in cybersecurity. That's a challenge. We've seen AI specific risks like data leakage. So when you train a model on sensitive data and you try and stop the model from telling anybody about that sensitive data, these are AI specific threats. However, these are 2 areas that we do have processes and systems and a focus on already. So they're not necessarily entirely new concepts. Transparency, this is about ensuring that we understand the decisions that are being made, that people, either the end users or the builders of the technology, understand what's happening within and outputting from the system. Number 5 is essentially fairness, essentially not being biased. And this one is already something that is illegal. So we have already got, like, the Product Liability Directive. We already have laws that govern discrimination. We're not allowed to discriminate. So the AI Act takes this to kind of the next level and has specific requirements in around AI systems and what they can and can't do in this area. But this is something that's already illegal, even if it's not very well enforced by regulators. Number 6, environmental and societal well-being. This is very much not that well referenced in the AI Act. It's building technology that doesn't harm our society. So while there are things like in Article 5 that say, you can't manipulate people, protects democratic rights, essentially evaluating the impact on society of a system, an AI system or a piece of technology, is quite difficult, and it's not very specifically enforced. Similarly, with the environment, the focus right now in industry, people don't really look at things like computational load unless it relates to the processing power. So generally, people want to reduce the complexity of a system in order to make it run faster on the hardware that they have. But really, people aren't thinking too much about the environment. And the environmental impact of AI is going to be significant. Everybody's celebrating the launch of data centers and not really looking at the fact that there's a huge environmental and societal cost to AI. People talk about changes in the job market, but realistically, what we're already seeing is within Ireland, AI is helping people to do their jobs a little bit better. But what we're seeing in developing countries is sweatshops of programmers who are doing the back end work of AI systems, the labeling, and things like that. And that's what's actually making the AI industry kind of keep alive right now. It's dependent on really underpaid workforces in developing countries. So that's a real concern and not really something that's majorly being talked about. And then the seventh principle is accountability. So if an auditor is going to come in, is the system accountable? Does it have the documentation? Is it possible for someone to see how the decisions are made and what's happening within the system? So earlier this year, or late last year, myself and Dr. Malika Bendichache published a paper on metrics for each of those principles. The reason we did that was because some of the principles are researched and there are metrics to try and evaluate how well AI systems are performing for those. For example, there are a number of metrics for fairness. So already within HR, systems for recruitment or insurance models, credit lending, there are a number of fairness metrics which have already been published by researchers. They're typically not adopted in industry at the moment because it's just not necessarily the standard, and there are no standards really developed. But fairness in of itself is actually quite well researched, in particular for machine learning. There are a number of safety metrics emerging, and everything else really there is not that much research. Another finding that we had was when people start to evaluate a system for fairness, for example, you can retrain the model and say, this model is being biased against, for example, men for car insurance. We would like to fix that. And when you retrain the model, it generally has a trade-off with some other metric or multiple other metrics. So being compliant and being trustworthy, it's not really binary. It's about balancing the trade-offs between each. So, for example, improving fairness could have an effect on privacy, or improving privacy could have an effect on accuracy. And this is something that needs to be researched for every single use case, and standards needs to be kind of developed for what's an acceptable trade-off, what's an acceptable metric, what's an acceptable threshold. So yeah, some challenges was we're at the very, very early stages of AI. And so while the technology itself is being developed and deployed, there are no metrics and benchmarks. Microsoft Copilot, for example, has been rolled out across a number of companies. If companies didn't roll it out, what would happen is employees would, and what they found was employees were just using free versions of, ChatGPT, which comes with its own risks, putting proprietary company information into a system like that. So a lot of companies have started to roll out these employee assistants. But what we know is these types of assistants work better for some people than others. Based on the way that you give the prompts, they work better for certain demographics. And so when employers are giving a tool that could improve the productivity of a person by 50%, 60%, 70%, I think the average is 30% increase in productivity. But if that tool is being rolled out to everybody, but it actually works better inherently for some people based on how it's built and designed, you're then holding back other people and advancing some other certain demographics. Because we don't have metrics that are standardized to actually evaluate these tools and to actually test, okay, the performance of this LLM assistant, on a percentage scale is this, and then to correlate that to some like protected demographics to see, are we, after rolling out some technology that's working, poorly for people of specific ages, for different genders, without these metrics, we can be sure, and when we test them, we can be sure that that's exactly what we've done. So we've done this very, very quickly without any metrics or benchmarks to show what's acceptable. Similarly, it's very, very difficult to score across multiple principles. So we can look at performance of the model, or we can look at fairness of the model, but it's very, very difficult to score across multiple principles. And then also, even when we do identify good fairness metrics, when we test them for different use cases, so for example, finance and health, different metrics are more suitable for different use cases. And that's a challenge that needs to be worked out at a sector level. In the paper, we propose a starting point for each of the 7 principles. So the classification that we've proposed for fairness is group fairness, individual and counterfactual fairness, intersectional, complex fairness metrics, inclusive design and participation. So making sure that we're building systems that are inclusive and work for all types of people. Within the other principles, the classifications, we generally stuck fairly close to what the EU had outlined within their principles. And only in the area of transparency and fairness did we really move away from that, because there was a good bit of research done in those areas. So the EU AI Act, which I suppose everybody has heard about at this point, it does 2 things. I'll go through this first. So people talk a lot about sandboxes and risk-based approach and all this kind of stuff, but essentially there's 2 key things to know about the AI Act. Firstly, the role that you have in relation to the technology that you're using or building is one of the most important factors. So if you're in an organization and you're just deploying some AI systems that you've bought from somebody else, your role is the AI deployer. As the AI deployer, you can really lean a lot on the provider of that technology to steer you into what you need to be doing in order to be compliant. You have obligations, but the bulk of the obligations sit with the person who provides the AI system. And that is essentially the person who puts the product on the market. So if you're buying a tool that's been given to you by somebody else, in almost all cases, you will just be the deployer, and you can ask your provider for a number of things. However, if you buy a piece of technology, like say, for example, ChatGPT, and you deploy it in your organization, but you make significant changes to it, you make changes to that AI system, changing the feature selection or weighting in a way that significantly alters the performance of that, you actually become the AI provider. Similarly, if you buy a piece of software and put it on the market in your own name, you become the AI provider. There are a number of different ways that you can actually become the AI provider. And if that happens, you are responsible for the bulk of the deliverables of the Act. It's not to say the AI deployers don't have any responsibility, but the bulk of the responsibilities will sit with the provider. The second thing to know about the AI Act is that there are different rules for different types of AI systems. And what they've done is they've classed the risk based not on how advanced the technology is. There's technology, simple machine learning technology that's 15 years old, that's classed as high risk. And the reason that is it's based on the effect to fundamental rights and safety. So they've identified a number, there's an annex there, Annex 3, and they've identified a number of use cases that are considered high risk. And these are things that affect our fundamental rights, like the right to credit, the right to access public services. A lot of it is to do with education. So if you're using tools for education, these are all classed, if it affects the learning outcome or how the student is going to be taught, this is all classed as high risk. And we can use high risk technology, but we really need to make sure that it's safe, because it is very strictly regulated within the AI Act. The unacceptable risks, those are what's covered in Article 5, prohibited practices. And these are things like manipulation, exploitation of vulnerable groups. And as I said, that comes into force in less than a week. And the high risk, the rest of it, comes into force in August next year. So the requirements for high risk are very significant. There are any providers of AI systems have to provide the deployer with performance metrics and also an explanation as to why they chose those metrics. And if we go back to the latest research in this area around metrics, including the paper that we published last year, there really isn't a lot of standardization for metrics. And so to come up with those metrics and justification by next year is going to be a real challenge. The system documentation that's required is quite significant. And there's another piece which is called a post-market monitoring plan. So if you're deploying any AI software, you have to ask, and you should be getting from your provider, a post-market monitoring plan. And what's required to be in that plan will be included in a template that the EU are going to publish by the 2nd of February next year at the latest. And that will stipulate everything that the AI provider needs to tell you around how you should be monitoring that, what oversight is needed, what the metrics are. They haven't published the template yet, but we can expect that that's what will be included in this monitoring plan. And then you'll be able to go and implement that within your organizations. Or if you're the AI provider, you'll need to go ahead and actually make that template and provide it to anybody that you're selling your AI system to. Some recommendations around this are that the evaluation criteria and the work being done, it really needs to happen on a sector level. It's not the case that one industry will develop the standards and then everybody else will roll that out. It will be in a sector and use case level. We'll have to develop the standardized metrics, and those will be developed over time in conjunction with that post-market monitoring plan. And then evaluations and oversight will have to be very specific to use cases. Something which is sort of starting to happen now is this idea of incorporating stakeholder feedback. So when we design a knowledge structure, or when I say I was to design a knowledge structure and I was to take a bunch of information and structure it, I can only do that from my perspective. And if I'm building a piece of AI technology, I'm really building that from a singular perspective. And so right now, the people who are building AI technology, it's a very specific group of people. The people who design and come up with those ideas in boardrooms, in startups, in companies that are already existing, the people who decide what money gets put into each of those companies, what's a good idea, what should actually be developed and how it should be built. It's a very specific group of people. And yet that technology will be built and rolled out to everybody with a smartphone and will have a huge impact on how the world gets developed and on our culture, on our values. And so this idea of incorporating stakeholder and societal feedback early on is something that's really going to be a core part of ethics by design. If we're building something for somebody or deciding to buy a piece of technology, we need to be going and asking the people who are impacted by that, and also other people across organizations who might have ideas about this, what we're doing, to give us feedback. And if we ask 50 people for some feedback, maybe a lot of it won't be helpful, but maybe some of that feedback will be helpful and will help us to shape better technology that's more useful for the end user and just more beneficial for society. And then the other piece is to, of course, consider the environmental and social sustainability of what we're building. If the technology that we choose to build is technology that's, for example, designed to make more money, to sell more products, these are the types of things we want to start to question now under this. And there's a lot of talk around innovation and competitiveness within the EU, but realistically, it's a different race that we necessarily are looking at. So there's reports out about the competitiveness of the EU, but we really want to take a step back and take a wider look at our society and the types of technology we're building and the trade-offs that those have against environmental and social sustainability for the kind of world we're trying to envision. So looking forward, if you are in the academic space, essentially, we're at the very, very start of this. We can think of AI as just like the word computers was used in the 80s. So we're all studying computers, just a piece of technology, the next tier of computer. And so anything that we decide to study right now, we could really become a leader in. But some specific things in this specific area is to look at more scoring for all of the 7 principles. There's a lot of work needed into trade-offs between the principles. The development of semi-automated evaluation tools. And the reason for this is currently in industry, and I mentioned it earlier, we use ISO standards a lot and NIST standards a lot. I'm currently writing a paper where, as part of it, I interviewed 15 people across all kind of big companies, people who, from some of the biggest social media companies and different tech companies, in roles like data scientists, privacy leads, people who are rolling out these ISO standards. And the feedback that's come is that ISO standards are not fit for purpose. These are checklist-based, document-based approaches of auditing. And what we need to start looking for is more reproducible and quantifiable ways of evaluating AI systems. And so that idea of developing something that's semi-automated to actually tangibly evaluate AI systems is something that we really need to start looking towards. And then the next piece is integrating concepts like trustworthy AI in the design process of systems. And this is doing things like putting out that stakeholder questionnaire early on. It's things like having checklists for ethical considerations at each stage of the design process. And it's something that we're going to see because people are going to start having to adhere, particularly in the high-risk sectors, to these standards. And so we're going to start seeing these changes in organizations. Just like we stopped leaving stacks of data around, just like we reimagined how we think about data, we're going to start reimagining how we think about ethics within the AI design process. So it's a good area for research. If anybody that's on the call is in the space of industry, I'm currently working on a couple of AI councils and looking at essentially what companies should be doing right now. So I'll go through them very quickly, but essentially the first thing that organizations should be doing, including universities, is doing an inventory of what AI systems they are using. So even looking at things like HubSpot, Salesforce, what AI is actually being used, not just looking at LLMs, not just looking at, the more newer technology, looking at actually what tools do we use that has machine learning built into it. And then I went through earlier the roles and the risk class. So identifying, are we the provider? Are we the deployer? There's a couple of other roles, but essentially those are the top two. And then figuring out, are we the provider or deployer of any high risk or prohibited systems, which you really have a week to figure out for the prohibited. Developing AI policies. So this is something that a lot of people already started working on. And finally, doing a risk management plan, ideally aligned with the ISO standard in this area. And that will likely include a lot of training and upskilling over a period of the next few years, integrating the ethics by design processes, like the stakeholder feedback, like the ethics questionnaires at different stages. A big part of it is improving documentation. So any high-risk model needs to have documentation for every version of that model. And this is huge. Like if you think about something like the insurance industry or the financial services sector for credit lending, typically those types of industries, they're changing their models constantly. They're changing the weightings and feature selection in their models constantly. Every time they change a model going forward, the AI Act stipulates they need to have documentation and performance testing for that model. So if you're doing that every single day or once a week or once a month or multiple times a day, that's a creation of a lot of documents and a lot of testing. So huge changes there. Then looking at the monitoring metrics and thresholds and putting the right controls and oversight in place. So these are the key things that organizations are starting to look for. And it will be very sector specific. So I'm working with some organizations where they're primarily the deployer, and those companies are really going to be at this stage pushing back to everybody who sells them AI technology and giving them a questionnaire that they should be filling out. And that questionnaire will include the things that we expect to get from the post-market monitoring template. And we don't need to wait until August next year to start asking for this. We should be asking for these things now and getting ahead of it and making sure that anything we're introducing doesn't introduce unnecessary risks that's going to cause us problems next year. I've also working with a lot of companies who are the AI provider. So these are people who are building technology, either whether they're building it from scratch or whether they're building something on the application layer of ChatGPT, or Gemini. So anybody who's using a large language model and fine tuning it and putting it on the market as a product for a specific sector, they are actually the AI provider for that. So even though they haven't built that large language model, they're still providing that technology and are responsible for a number of things. And those companies are the first companies who are now starting to put in all of these things into place so that they can kind of ensure that they're developing their products in a way that isn't going to require huge changes next year for the AI Act. I think we're going to leave a good bit of time for questions. I think there's a real mixed group of people on here, so hopefully I'll be able to go through a good few questions that people have as well. And then also, you can also email me. Feel free to, or add me on LinkedIn.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Louise. That was so enlightening and interesting. And we do have quite a few questions.